It was Christmas 2008 in rural Kilkenny, Ireland.
30-year-old Sharon Whelan and her 2 daughters are found dead in a house fire.
Police quickly realised this wasn't an accident.
We're doing a full recap of Season 1 of Inside the Crime, The Whelan Family Murder, on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time. Jeff, I heard you went curling last week. How did you find it?
It was awesome. It was really hard. I fell down a lot.
Not shocking. So while you were on the ice, did you do anything, useful with your time?
Yeah, actually, there was one point where I had fallen down on the ice and I couldn't quite figure out how to stand up without falling down again. And so I pulled out my phone and I went over to Patreon. And I thought, maybe this would be a good use of my time while I'm down here on the ice, failing to curl. And I went to the So Much Crime, So Little Time Patreon page. And, it really it made me feel better. And yeah, I have some bruises. But the warmth in my heart of supporting this show just really made up for any physical injuries.
That's amazing. You know what I did while I was not curling last week, but was sitting on my couch watching fun movies with friends? I bought Christmas presents for my entire family. Guess what that Christmas present was, Jeff?
Was it Patreon?
It was a patreon.com/so much crime, so little time monthly subscription for all my brothers, my sister-in-laws, my parents. Great gift. I think everyone's going to be chuffed. Who needs more toys, eh?
Patreon.com/so much crime, so little time.
Thank you. Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Dee.
And I'm Jeff. And before we start, just a warning.
Warning.
This episode is going to have spoilers for Inside the Crime Season 1, The Whelan Family Story. We are going to discuss the whole series here.
If you haven't listened yet, check out our preview episode on this show. It's the one before this one in your feed.
You'll also find a link to Inside the Crime in our show notes. Before we get into our discussion, let's just remind everyone what this show is. So, first of all, if you remember when we covered Inside the Crime before, the Una Linsky murder, that was Season 3. We're now going back in time, but forward in time to a crime that happened. It's confusing. Anyway, this is Season 1 of Inside the Crime. It came out in the winter of 2021. The host is Frank Greaney. There are 5 episodes, although I'd like to discuss whether we think there should be 5 episodes. Each one is about 30 to 45 minutes long. And Dee, what happened in that first episode that we talked about last time?
In the first episode, we hear from Sharon's parents, Christy and Nancy. We learned a lot about Sharon and her daughter's 7.5-year-old Zara and 2.5-year-old Nadia. And we heard about the terrible Christmas in 2008 when Sharon and her daughters died in what first seemed like an accident, but quickly became a murder investigation. So, Jeff, episode 1 was tough.
Yes, it was.
Sometimes we listen to a first episode and we have feelings on it, and those, it's a very different episode to what comes after it. This wasn't. I didn't think. It was so upsetting.
If you were to graph how upsetting it was over the 5 episodes, it's not the same throughout the whole. I think it gets worse before it gets less upsetting. I don't know. We can jump right into this. I found it sort of frustratingly inconsistent over the 5 episodes.
Say more.
I talked in the preview episode about how I found the first, I think, to be a pretty rough listen. You're listening to these grandparents, Sharon's parents, the grandparents of little girls, basically grieve and cry, and it's so just terribly sad to listen to. And then in the next episode, we find out more about how this wasn't an accident, how this was murder, how Sharon had been raped, how she had been strangled. And then we get into who did it, which is Brian Hennessy, the local postman. And then we get into a lot, episodes 4 and 5, well, particularly 4, is just a lot about Irish sentencing laws and how that compares to laws in England and in America, which I just thought we just lost the thread of the whole kind of heart of the story, which is about this family and about these victims. To me, it just became, I don't know, for such a short show. It's only 5 episodes, right? Like it's real quick. But that was what I was alluding to when we were talking about, does it need to be 5 episodes? I thought it was done after 3. Really, I thought that was the whole story.
Interesting. I felt like the sentencing, you know, the kind of twist, for want of a better word, with the sentencing was how the judge gave one sentence. There was an appeal. The appeal went through so quickly and it was overturned or whatever, and the sentencing was reduced. How would he finish there? That was confusing. It was confusing to Sharon's parents. It was confusing to Christy and Nancy and their son John. And so it felt like Inside the Crime is the name of the show. And I feel like it was the same in the Unalinsky murder, that it pivots to say, well, we're getting inside the crime, we're getting inside the sentencing, we're getting inside the details of it. And that's where I feel like it gives it its edge. I think a more salacious podcast might have done a 1 episode, focus in on the grief, focus in on this being like a really emotional story, because it is. It's, you know, a single mother and her 2 young kids on Christmas Day. I mean, come on. It is so very emotional. But it doesn't just stay with that. It pivots and it educates people on the why of it. And then it digs into a comparison because of what John's doing, which is saying they're too lenient. The Irish justice system doesn't allow or doesn't consider the victims and the victims' families enough in sentencing. And they felt lost in the whole situation. And how does England do that? And how does, or the UK do it? And how does the US do it, as being our like 2 neighbours? I mean, to me, that's the whole point of Inside the Crime.
I don't think it's comparable to the Unalinsky story, though, because the Unalinsky story took a hard pivot and stopped focusing on Unalinsky, which we talked about at the time. But it did seem like there was this whole other story.
There is a difference there. There's a difference there, because in the Unalinsky murder, what we didn't love is how it took a hard pivot. Not only did it stop focusing on Unalinsky, it focused purely on the person who was put behind bars. And that's different than what this does.
It's different, but also, I'm not saying this would have been good, and this is probably why they didn't do it, but like a different version of this podcast would have spent an episode talking about Brian Hennessy and like his background, but I don't think didn't seem to be any reason for that. I don't think that would have necessarily added anything to the story, but I just felt like it got lost in the weeds of something that is so sort of, in a way, I get how it relates to proper punishment. So what we're talking about is he was initially sentenced to serve 3 mandatory life sentences, but with 2 of them being concurrent for the murders of the girls. And then for Sharon's murder, like that would be consecutive. So basically 2 consecutive life sentences. And that got overturned to being all 3 running concurrently, which means he was eligible for parole remarkably quickly. I think originally it was 8 years, but now the law is 12 years. He's eligible for parole. I mean, I think that was interesting. I don't know. Like, I feel like we've had this debate before about like what is an appropriate punishment and what is enough. And it's never going to be enough for the victims' families. I understand that. I empathize with that. But the other side of that is I'm also coming from the point of view of a country where there are excessive punishments for many crimes. And I just feel like it's sort of and they made this point in the podcast of, okay, in the U.S. there's 50 different laws on this in 50 different states. We're going to pick Wisconsin sort of arbitrarily. It's sort of middle of the road. But, I mean, they could have done 12 more episodes and covered, like, a bunch more states in the U.S. and it would have all been different. I just don't know what you get from that. Like, it doesn't help the family. It doesn't.
I think it helps the listeners, though. It gives context. In our Irish bubble, we can say, well, Ireland does it one way, and we look at the UK and we're like, okay, well, they do it a different way to us. But there's some issues that have been raised regarding that. And so why not look to America? And I wonder, did they reach out to a lot of people in a lot of different states, and this is the one that got back to them? Like, that could have been as simple as that. I just feel like it was I thought it was interesting to compare the three and see how pretty different they are. Like there were some similarities with the US, but then there was kind of some stark differences as well.
What do you think is the appropriate punishment for this crime?
I don't know how to answer that. I don't know how to answer that. I feel like when you think of two young kids and he knowingly killed them, and you know the vicious rape and sexual assault that Sharon had to endure at his hands, and then going about his day like nothing happened. Like how this isn't a crime of passion. This isn't this is just I don't know how to answer that without making myself look like a horrible wench, but I don't know how much freedom Brian Hennessy deserves.
So that's the thing. What do we do with that question? I guess that's part of my frustration towards the end of this is I don't think there's a case to be made that, he should get out of prison after 8 years or 12 years.
No, but is the point not like in Ireland, things are so narrow and your choices are so narrow, and you have someone like Brian Hennessy who has committed and been found guilty of, I know the sexual assault was dropped in him pleading guilty, but we're looking at how lenient this is of a sentence for him. And what would have happened had he spared the two children's lives? He would have got the same punishment.
Yeah, I'm not making the case that he was over.
It's the same thing. Yeah. And then we're discounting the other two lives that he knowingly took. Innocent lives, not that Sharon wasn't innocent, but Jesus, like the two girls did absolutely nothing.
Right.
And how... if someone was to murder someone in a crime of passion, would they end up getting the same amount if it's two people going head to head and arguing and getting into a physical altercation and someone accidentally goes too far? Are they getting the same punishment? Is that what's happening here? Because it just feels like it's too narrow. This is not a crime of passion. This was not an accident. This was very intentional.
This has come up before, and it still surprises me to hear that we're hearing what his sentence is, and then it's like, in Ireland, it's a mandatory life sentence for this crime. A specific crime has a specific sentence, and the judge doesn't get to decide. It's just not what I'm used to. It seems sort of bizarre to me. And the idea you were eligible for parole after 8 years on a life sentence, and now it's 12. 12 still doesn't seem like a very long time. That being said, on the other hand, it sounds like people aren't mostly getting out after 12 years, and that I think what they say the average person serves 20 or 30 20 years.
20.
And then on the other end of that spectrum is it worth keeping someone in prison when they're 80? If at that point, like it's prohibitively expensive to keep them in prison, and they're really no threat to anyone at that point. They're elderly. Why? Like, I don't believe that we should have a bunch of elderly people in prison because of things they did when they were 20 years old. Like, that seems inhumane in a different way. At some point, hopefully the system has rehabilitated you. Hopefully you have atoned for your crimes, and as horrific as they may be.
But do you think if that roof had come down and all of the evidence was gone, do you think he would live the rest of his life having not killed someone?
I don't want to be the person on this podcast defending the guy who did this crime.
But do you honestly believe that, having listened to this podcast?
I don't know, because we don't know anything about him.
We know that he went there intentionally looking for sex. We know that he knew those children were there. And we know that he waited around for an hour or two before deciding how many fires to light. And we know that he was hoping the roof came down. That is enough for me.
We know what happened.
We also know the following day he sat there celebrating with his family as if nothing happened. Not one person realized.
That's true. But I think it would have been a better investigative journalism if we knew more than these couple of days in his life. What was he like as a person in the months and weeks and years before that?
But that's not the point of this podcast. I feel like you totally missed it. The entire point is this is Sharon and Zara and Nadia's life. And this is the impact it had on their family. And not only that, her brother is advocating for victims and their families to be brought into this. Like, that's the reason for those episodes on how different countries deal with this. Because in his mind, other countries are more, they come down harder on crimes like this one. And I don't care about anything to do with Brian Hennessy. I'm glad that that was only what we heard in this podcast. That it wasn't about him. It's about her. It's about her two daughters. And it was about her family and how much of an impact it had and how the court system kind of disregarded it. It was irrelevant that he sexually assaulted her. It was irrelevant that he raped her. It was irrelevant that it was 3 of them. It's his life and there'll be one sentence. And then on the headstone at the very end we hear, the very closing line is, it's 3 life sentences that Christy and Nancy are serving. It's not 1.
I hear all that, but I also think that it would make the case even stronger from the Whelan family about what more significant punishment he deserved if we knew more about him. I think you're being emotionally manipulated by the way this story was presented. I think I said this in the preview. I certainly thought it. I found the way that Sharon's parents were used in this podcast exploitative. I felt like it was exploiting their grief. And I understand that they willingly participated in this and that there was a point to what they were trying to do in getting this story out there about Irish sentencing laws and justice, what they felt was the justice that they weren't getting. And I empathize with that. And I agree with that. I don't think this was the right sentence. I don't think he should get out of prison. I don't think he should be paroled. But I also found this emotionally manipulative.
Was it like the music and the lines and the kind of the not drama, but the kind of
I think
the dramatic sentences used and all of that that you found to be and I slightly agree in a way. I will hold up my hand.
You're not all wrong. You're not all wrong.
You as a person.
Yeah.
No. I mean, no, I feel like your thoughts on the murderer are wrong, but that's a difference of opinion. I don't know. I do feel, I put my hands up and say, I think I may have a bias to this podcast because it's Irish.
Yes.
The music was a bit off-putting. The host was slightly dramatic, but I liked it. It evoked a lot of emotion in me at different parts, but it didn't lean in. It didn't speak gruesome. It didn't do what I hate podcasts doing, where they focus on the perpetrator or the murderer in this case. It didn't do that. It stayed focused on the victims. It also was a really heartwarming story, you know, of Frank Greaney and his team spending time with her parents. I don't believe that they would consistently let him in. I don't believe that they would bring him to the graveside and allow him to read aloud the poem that was on her grave. I don't think that they would open up to him if they didn't strike that relationship.
Sure.
And I really truly believe that they would have given the go-ahead to this before it went out. Just the way the policeman, the Garda, Brian, can't remember his name, it specifically said he spoke to Newstalk after getting their blessing. He got Christy and Nancy's blessing, first of all, and I'm sure Frank Greaney and his team got their blessing before releasing it too.
I don't think it was manipulating them. I think it was manipulating us. I also, to maybe say it in a different way, do you remember the thing about Pam? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of maybe fair criticisms of the way that story was presented and sort of the tone of it. But I also think that was the type of story, and that's just the example that popped to mind, but where the more you know about Pam, the harsher you think of each individual thing she did. Because you realize there's a monster there who, if not put behind bars, will just do this again and again and again. That's my point.
And that goes back to but that goes back to my story. Like, or my point is like, do you not believe that he will do this again and again and again? If you can commit something as horrendous and heinous as this, and then go and live your life as normal, go to the funeral.
Yeah, but we don't know that. Like, we don't have that.
Well, we know he wasn't in trouble beforehand. What more do you need to know? What more? Like, they could go digging and try and find if like there was ever like a sign that he might have turned into a grotesque person that would actually do this and be seemingly fine about it.
We might just have to agree to disagree on this. This is not going to go down as, I think, a story that I thought was, I don't know. I didn't find this to be a well-told story. I thought it swung wildly from this extreme emotional, like, vulnerability in episode 1 to really kind of mundane, in the weeds legal stuff in episode 4, and then let that hard pivot back at the end to visiting the graves. That, I don't know, it just didn't sit well with me.
Did you not, as someone who's in the US, did you not enjoy, but like, did you not find it fascinating to hear about the legal system and how they would deal with this in different countries? Especially when he asked specifically about this crime, what do you think might the sentencing be given X, Y, and Z as factors? I found that fascinating.
It's colored a little bit by my perception of the U.S. legal system as just being a complete free-for-all with, like, and that's the only thing I can say in defense of the Irish mandatory sentencing thing is, here you're at the whim of just the chaos and the biases and the state to state or district to district unfairness of the U.S. legal system. And it's almost just like a whole different shit show.
Yeah, and I get that, and we've discussed that quite a lot. I suppose from my point of view, it's kind of rare you see inside the crime and the sentencing of Irish legal systems. And given how much we've spoken about other legal systems, I actually thought you'd find it interesting how differently we do it there and how the public aren't happy about it. A lot of the public are not happy about it.
Are you mad that I didn't enjoy this more?
I'm a little bit angry right now. Not angry, that's like real far. But I'm shocked, I think, that you didn't enjoy it a little bit. I think you probably found it too emotional to listen to over Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I mean, maybe.
How many times did you cry?
0.
How many times did you nearly cry?
I was listening to that first episode while driving by myself in a car. Not that I would ever have anyone else in the car listening to one of these podcasts that we listen to. There's times where it comes on, like the Bluetooth connects to my phone, and like and someone else in the car. I'm like,
I'm diving into the car to pause it in front of my kids. Don't listen. It's horrendous.
But no, I mean, we've talked about this before. This is one where, like, I remember pulling up to a light and just being like this is just real heavy, real intense, and I think my thought at the time was, and I think I maybe said this in the preview, like, it's too much. Like, it's just
because it's followed after the curling episode. We went from talking about curling
and Jello before that, and but then before that it was Omaima Nelson, which was like,
not upsetting.
But there was like, that was one of the more gruesome things we ever talked about. But it was also, there was like an emotional distance from it.
Yeah,
we didn't hear from the victim's family there, so maybe that's part of it. Is we're so far removed from a horrible murder. Like, it's been a while.
Yeah,
that's probably all in the haze of my reaction to this. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you with my reaction to this podcast. That was not my...
Your actions don't upset me. I found the podcast upsetting, and I think your points about the murderer are just invalid, and I think the way the podcast was done, I feel a little bit protective over it. This is what I'm saying. I held my hands up and I said I think I'm biased about it because it's Irish. I
respect that. So the thing you said before, I do think it was interesting I think academically, intellectually, it was interesting to hear the contrast. And I always love hearing about, like, English law that goes back 1,000 years, and they used to just throw people in a lake and see if they float or whatever like that, or like pick up a hot stone and see, like, that. Those kinds of bizarre things from the past I find super fascinating. I just like the contrast of that with with this very deeply personal family story, it didn't sit right for me.
Yeah, see, that's baffling to me. I think they wove it together quite well. I think Frank Greaney did a great job. I thought the music at times was a little bit much. It was definitely like that, like trying to evoke emotion, and it did. I shed a tear at numerous times listening to this podcast. The You Brian Hennessy thing caught me. The poem at the end, just the parents talking in general. Jesus Christ, the hell that they're living.
When we talked about Una Linsky, that case, I think one of the things, because that was again an Irish story that I think you felt a very kind of close connection to, or you felt like listening to some of the people talking was like listening to family members, or like is there a similar thing going on here?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's very natural. Like, I have 2 young kids. My brother lives in Kilkenny. My parents are lovely people too. And it's just the idea that someone can do that and the impact that it would have on an entire family. Accidents happen and people are still left to grieve, and that's one thing. Or people can pass away suddenly from different reasons. But this was at the hand of someone who made a decision, who thought about it and made numerous decisions, didn't seem to be rushed in any way, and seemed to be very much, this is what I'm going to do. And I don't believe that Christy and Nancy and John and all of the rest of the Whelan family should have to live the life sentences that they are without Brian Hennessy living it as well. And that's how I feel. This is very different to other crimes that we've looked into.
No, it is. And I don't disagree with anything that you said. It doesn't hit as close to home for me, which is maybe understandable. So we listened to this podcast together before we started doing our show. And
yeah, I think I recommended it to you.
Yeah. And in a way, I feel like, and I mean, honestly, I don't remember how we talked about that, but I'm wondering if we had a similar argument or discussion, or
it would make sense, because I think that's what gave you between that and actually hearing your man, I can't remember his name, the guy was in, what county, state was he in? Michigan? Minnesota? Wisconsin?
Wisconsin.
Yeah. His accent and the Irish accent. This is all where it stemmed from, this entire podcast that we are doing right now, So Much Crime, So Little Time. This is where it stemmed from.
Yeah.
So I'd imagine we weren't in agreement then.
Yeah, because
we were... I don't know. Would I have agreed to do this podcast if you were so defensive of a piece of shit?
I'm not defending this man. I'm not defending... I'm criticizing the storytelling. I want to be perfectly clear.
I know. I wasn't joking.
I don't want that to be the takeaway from this episode. Jeff defends horrible murder.
A prick.
Yeah.
Mm.
I do want to, before we wrap up, just mention real quick, I don't know if you saw this, but so this podcast came out in 2021, in June of 2024. So 6 months ago from when we were recording this. Brian Hennessy had applied for parole again. So he was up for parole again, and it was denied. He is eligible again in 2026, which that's another part of this that they didn't really get into. They got into a little bit in the podcast, but the fact that he can reapply, so in 2024 and then again in 2026, and that means that the family has to go through the process of writing the letters and trying to make the case of why he should not be paroled. That is cruel. I think that is a horrible thing that they have to go through. Like and they did talk about in the podcast that they have to write a letter that then gets sent to him. So it's like writing this letter that he is going to read. Why? Like, why do they have to do that?
I mean, they shouldn't have to.
No.
3 life sentences. Before you hear about next week's show, don't forget to leave us a comment, rate us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, and tell a friend, tell your neighbour, tell the bin man when he comes around at Christmas time, tell your doctor, tell your dentist, tell your beauty therapist as she's doing your nails for the Christmas season. Thank you. And as always, thank you for listening.
Over the next 2 weeks, over the Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year's season, we are going to have some very special episodes to commemorate the end of the year, at the end of our first year of doing this show. First up, on Sunday, we're going to re-release our preview, the second show we covered, which was The Thing About Pam, with a brand new, all-new Time Machine segment. Same thing we did over Thanksgiving with Una Linsky, this time with Pam. We're going to go back in the time machine to 2011 when the crime that kicks off The Thing About Pam first occurred. After that, we're going to release a couple more brand new, different kinds of episodes for us, including a special wrap-up episode where we look back on all of 2024 and all that we covered in the true crime world, such as it is, as well as looking ahead to 2025 and what's coming up. So we're going to have new episodes coming out. It's going to be a mix of different things, but starting with a special new version of The Thing About Pam. That's on the next So Much Crime,
So Little Time.
So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of Mind Glove Media. The executive producer is Paxton Caloriso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Our theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show on your podcast app. And don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening. We didn't even talk about the fact that this is on Christmas.
I know. Happy Christmas, everyone!